All right, let's get started today. We're diving deep into Germany during World War I,
Yeah.
but not just the battles. We're going to go beyond the trenches
Mm-hmm.
and really see how the war, transformed German society from the inside out.
Hmm.
We've got some fascinating excerpts here from pasted text.
Yeah.
It details, all the upheaval within Germany,
Yeah.
economically, socially, politically,
Mm-hmm.
during the war. So get ready for things like, have you ever heard of the turnip winter?
Turned up winter,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're going to get into that.
Wow.
It's as weird as it sounds. And we'll uncover how daily life was completely upended
Mm-hmm.
and why the war's end was just the beginning of a whole new set of troubles for Germany.
Right.
So to kick things off, pasted text paints a picture of Germany in 1914, right when the war breaks out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's surprising because it seems like everyone was incredibly optimistic.
Yeah.
They thought, oh, this is going to be a quick victory.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There was widespread enthusiasm. This belief in a swift victory for Germany. And the government and the military, they were really pumping out propaganda
Oh, yeah.
that fueled this nationalistic fervor. Just imagine, streets full of people cheering,
Yeah.
soldiers marching off to war.
Uh-huh.
Everyone's convinced they'd be home by Christmas.
It's almost chilling to think about that, knowing how WWI actually unfolded.
Right. It's like this stark contrast between that initial
Yeah.
optimism and the reality of, years of brutal trench warfare.
It makes it even more heartbreaking,
It
really.
really does. And I think that initial hope makes the disillusionment and the suffering that
Yeah.
followed even more powerful.
So at what point did we got this attitude crash into the realities of total war?
Well, as the war dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just a fight on battlefields.
Yeah.
Germany really embraced this concept of total war,
Mm-hmm.
meaning their entire society was mobilized for the war effort.
So even if you weren't a soldier on the front lines,
Right.
you were still impacted by it.
Absolutely. You go to the store and the shelves are bare. Maybe the factory in your town that used to make, I don't know, clothes or something,
Yeah.
is now churning out artillery shells. Your husband, your son, maybe even your daughter are off fighting or contributing to the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
And you're left to figure out how to manage, the farm, or you have to go find work in a munitions factory.
Yeah.
It was really all hands on deck. And it just turned daily life upside down for everyone in Germany.
So with all the men, for example, off fighting,
Right?
this is where women started to take on these new roles.
Exactly. Women really stepped up big time,
Yeah.
working in factories, on farms, offices,
Uh-huh.
doing jobs that, traditionally were seen as men's work.
Yeah.
They were essential to keeping the country going,
Yeah.
but it didn't come without its own set of challenges.
Like what were some of the issues that women faced?
Well, the big one, the one we see time and time again, unfortunately, is that women were paid less than men for doing the same job. Their contributions were vital,
Yeah.
but they didn't get that same recognition or pay.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the working conditions were often pretty terrible.
Right. So it's like, even in a crisis like this, the inequalities don't just disappear.
No, they don't. Now, on top of this whole internal mobilization, Germany is dealing with the British naval blockade.
Oh, right. That blockade basically choked off, all of their trading with the outside world.
Yeah.
What was the impact of that?
The impact was massive.
Yeah.
It meant vital imports, especially food and fuel, were incredibly scarce.
Uh-huh.
Imagine relying on turnips,
Oh, wow.
usually for animal feed as your main source of food.
Yeah.
That's how bad it got.
Turnip winter.
Turnip winter of 1916-17.
Sounds awful.
Oh, it was brutal. People were really struggling to survive.
Yeah.
Malnutrition was widespread. The price of bread, because of inflation,
Mm-hmm.
shot up an incredible 700%.
700%.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, worker strikes became more and more common.
Yeah.
People were desperate.
Yeah.
They started pointing fingers at the government.
It's crazy to think that something as basic as bread could become
Yeah.
so expensive.
Yeah.
And it really shows you the level of hardship they were facing.
Oh, absolutely. And this is all happening, while the war is dragging on hopes of a quick victory or fading, and people are starting to realize, that maybe their leaders were a bit too optimistic in the beginning.
So it sounds like the war wasn't just changing things on the battlefields, it was really tearing apart the social and economic fabric of Germany.
Absolutely. And I think all of this discontent is going to have some serious political consequences.
That's what we're going to get into next, right?
Exactly. That's where things get even more interesting.
Right.
You know, this brewing storm of social and economic unrest.
Yeah.
It's really going to shake the very foundations of German power.
All right, so we'll be right back after a short break. You know, it's crazy to think that while so many were struggling,
Yeah.
some people actually saw the war as an opportunity.
That's true.
Like women, for example, joining the workforce in huge numbers,
Yeah.
doing jobs they never would have the chance to do before.
Mm-hmm.
It's like progress, but progress born from a desperate situation.
Right. I mean, it was a change that came out of necessity,
Yeah.
but, you know, it really challenged those traditional gender roles in a way that, well, had ripple effects that lasted for decades.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, what if those opportunities
Mm-hmm.
had come about without a war?
It's a great point. And like we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
it wasn't all, you know, perfect for women. They were
Right.
still paid less, working tough conditions. And a lot of times, once the war ended,
Yeah.
they got pushed right back into those traditional roles.
Yeah. Such a bittersweet reality.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the soldiers,
Yeah.
ones who actually made it back home.
Yeah. Paste to Text really talks about how psychologically devastating the war was.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, imagine coming home after years of seeing that kind of brutality,
Right.
coming back to a world that just seems to have moved on without you.
Yeah. I mean, these soldiers came back deeply scarred, physically and mentally,
Yeah.
by what they experienced.
Right. We know it today as PTSD.
Yeah.
But back then it was called shell shock, right?
Exactly. And, you know, back then, there wasn't really much in the way of support
Right.
for veterans who are dealing with these invisible wounds.
Yeah.
And they felt betrayed
Hmm.
by the government, by society, even by people who hadn't been on the front lines.
Yeah. So you've got this disillusionment among veterans
Mm-hmm.
on top of all the hardships the civilians are facing.
Yeah.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious social unrest.
And that's exactly what happened. The war really exacerbated these class divisions that already existed,
Okay.
with the working class really bearing the brunt of the economic fallout.
It seems like the wealthier classes always manage to kind of
Right.
shield themselves from the worst of it.
Yeah, sadly, that's often the case.
Yeah.
And, you know, that inequality just fueled the flames of resentment even more.
So was there any, like, pushback against this? Did people just accept it?
Oh, absolutely not. Think about the Berlin strike of 1918.
Sorry.
Over 1 million workers went on strike, you know, demanding better conditions.
Wow.
It was a huge display of just how fractured German society had become because of the war.
So while all of this is happening, all this social and economic turmoil, what's
Hmm.
going on politically?
Well, you can't really separate the social and economic chaos from the political crisis that was unfolding,
Right.
you know, as the war dragged on.
Yeah.
And defeat was looking more and more likely.
Uh-huh.
Kaiser Wilhelm II, you know, the guy who had once been a symbol of national pride,
Right.
he became the scapegoat for all of Germany's problems.
It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy.
Isn't it? The military defeats, the suffering at home, it all chipped away at his authority.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have these military leaders
Okay.
like Ludendorff and Hindenburg who are gaining influence,
Yeah.
which further marginalizes the Kaiser.
Okay, so how did this power shift actually, like, play out?
So the Kaiser's political power is dwindling as these strikes are intensifying
Yeah.
and discontent is growing. And it's important to note that you have socialist and communist movements that are gaining traction at this time,
Okay.
offering a different vision for Germany.
So in the midst of all this chaos,
Yeah,
those groups started to look more and more appealing.
exactly. Groups like the Spartacist League, you know, led by figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they were calling for a complete overhaul. They wanted a workers' revolution. They believed the working class should have the power.
So this push for change,
Yeah.
coupled with all the other pressures,
Mm-hmm.
leads to the Kaiser's downfall.
It was the final straw, yeah.
Wow.
In November 1918, you have this wave of uprisings and mutinies,
Yeah.
starting with the Kiel Mutiny that
Right.
sweep through Germany.
Uh-huh.
And this is what we often call the German Revolution.
Okay.
And it forces the Kaiser to abdicate.
Wow. So the war that started with all this nationalistic fervor
Mm-hmm.
ends with the collapse of the monarchy.
Yeah. It's a pretty dramatic turn of events.
It really is.
Yeah,
But it also shows how transformative war can be.
it does.
But the Kaiser stepping down wasn't the end of the story?
No, not at all.
Right.
It was just the start of a new chapter,
Mhm.
and that chapter came with a whole new set of challenges.
Because even though the fighting stopped,
Yeah,
the war's consequences were far from over.
exactly. And I think this is most apparent when we look at the Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
For a lot of people in Germany, it felt like the final blow,
Yeah.
shattering any hope of a smooth recovery.
Right. So the treaty was signed in June 1919, and it imposed these incredibly harsh terms on Germany.
Terms that some would argue were intended to really cripple Germany,
Yeah.
both economically and psychologically.
Can you give us a rundown of the most impactful parts of the treaty? Like,
Yeah.
how did it actually unfold?
Well, first, and probably the most damaging,
Yeah.
was the war guilt clause.
Okay.
This clause placed the blame for the entire war squarely on Germany's shoulders.
Wow.
This was a huge humiliation for the German people,
Yeah.
and it fueled this sense of resentment that would really fester for decades.
It's almost like being forced to confess to a crime you didn't commit.
Right, it had to be psychologically damaging.
Yeah.
And then you have the reparations,
Bruh.
these massive financial burdens imposed on Germany to compensate the Allies for war damages.
Pasted text mentions this crazy sum of 6.6 billion pounds.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money,
A lot of money.
especially for a country that's already struggling.
It was a crushing debt that further devastated their already fragile economy.
Yeah.
And to top it off, Germany lost these key industrial territories like
Yeah.
the Saar Basin, vital coal fields.
So not only were they blamed for the war, they were also stripped of their ability to recover economically.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the military restrictions.
Yeah, the treaty basically disarmed Germany.
Yeah, essentially. The army was drastically reduced in size, forbidden from having tanks, submarines, or an air force.
Wow.
And the Rhineland, a very strategically important region, was demilitarized.
Okay.
It left Germany feeling very vulnerable, exposed, which again just added to that feeling of resentment and injustice.
So you have this nation dealing with economic ruin, feeling humiliated.
Right.
And scared because they're defenseless.
Yeah.
It sounds like, powder keg ready to explode.
And unfortunately, that's kind of what happened. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to create lasting peace, actually laid the groundwork for future conflict.
That's such a tragic irony.
Yeah.
That the treaty designed to prevent war might have actually made another one more likely.
It really is. It makes you wonder if there could have been another way, a more balanced approach that might have led to a different outcome.
So the impact of the treaty really went beyond just the post-war period.
Oh, absolutely.
How did it continue to shape Germany in the years that followed?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The seeds of extremism,
Mm-hmm.
the rise of ideologies that would completely reshape the world.
Yeah.
Well, they were planted in this fertile ground of resentment and instability.
Germany after World War I, it's hard to grasp what they went through. It was like this perfect storm, right? Economic hardship, social unrest, political instability. It's like the war just shattered everything.
It did. And then, like we've been talking about, the Treaty of Versailles just made everything so much worse.
Right. Like you said, those harsh terms, especially that war guilt clause, it left them feeling cheated.
It's understandable why it led to the whole stab in the back myth.
Yeah, explain that. Like, what is that?
So the stab in the back myth, it's this idea that Germany, that they didn't actually lose the war. They were betrayed by their own people.
Okay.
Politicians, socialists, even Jewish people. It really twisted the truth,
So instead of just accepting defeat, a lot of Germans believed that they had been, like, unfairly targeted.
Exactly.
And robbed of victory. That sounds like the perfect breeding ground for extremism.
Oh, it was. Extremist groups, especially the ones with these nationalist and anti-democratic views, they really exploited this feeling of resentment.
So they offered this simple explanation.
Yeah, and they had these scapegoats for all of Germany's problems.
Right.
They tapped into that anger, the humiliation that so many people were feeling.
Which brings us to the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
They were especially good at taking advantage of all this.
Oh, they were masters at it. They blamed the Weimar Republic, the new democratic government, for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. They said the Republic was weak, spineless.
So the treaty that was supposed to prevent another war,
Yeah.
it created the perfect environment for these extremist ideologies to flourish.
And it gets worse because Germany was also dealing with hyperinflation at the time.
Oh, right.
It was so bad that people had to use wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
It's hard to even imagine that.
Unemployment was rampant.
And people were desperate.
They were. They needed someone to blame. They needed solutions. And the Nazis, well, they stepped right in.
It's like they offered this, I don't know, this twisted sense of hope.
Yeah, a promise to restore Germany to its former glory, no matter the cost.
And they did it by preying on people's fear.
Fear, anger,
Yeah.
They offered these simple solutions, this vision of a strong, unified Germany that really resonated with people.
So, as we wrap this up, World War I, it didn't really end in 1918, did it?
No, not at all. Its impact continued to shape the 20th century for Germany and the whole world.
It set off this chain of events.
It's like a domino effect.
That ultimately led to another world war.
It's a stark reminder that the consequences of war, they reach far beyond the battlefield. They last long after the fighting stops, shaping societies, economies, political systems.
So what's the big takeaway here?
I think it's crucial to remember that war, it has these ripple effects. We have to learn from the past, work towards a future where these kinds of conflicts can be prevented.
It's a powerful thought. Thanks for walking us through all of this.
It was my pleasure.
And for everyone listening, we hope you keep exploring this period in history. Think about how it's relevant today, and let's work together to create a future where peace and progress can flourish.